Welcome and thank you all for joining us. My name is Denise Jorgens and I'm the director here at International House at the University of Chicago. On behalf of the International House community, we are so pleased to partner with the Center for Contemporary Theory on their 20th anniversary conference, Theory Now: Practices, Predicaments, and Possibilities. This is also a special year for the International House community, as our first International House in New York City is celebrating their 100th anniversary. International House of Chicago was founded by John D. Rockefeller Jr. in 1932, and so our 100th anniversary is only a few years away. From the day International House opened its doors, our mission has been to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among students and scholars, and on the part of the people of metropolitan Chicago and the broader communities that we serve toward individuals of all nations and backgrounds. Through the International House student life experience and our internationally focused public programming, such as today's event, International House is dedicated to transforming people's lives for a better world. This mission is further extended through the work of the International House's worldwide organization, which today is a network of 16 international houses on 4 continents. We invite you to join us throughout the remainder of the academic year for many of our other Global Voices Performing Arts and Lecture Series programs, including during Alumni Weekend, when we are going to host a very special program titled The Frenzied First 100 Days, covering Trump in unprecedented waters, moderated by John Carl of ABC News. Information about all of our upcoming programs is in the foyer area and on our website, where you can also sign up to receive our weekly newsletter. On behalf of the Global International House community, I want to welcome you again and thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to invite Professor Amanda Woodward, the William S. Gray Distinguished Service Professor of Psychology and Dean of the Division of the Social Sciences, to formally introduce our program. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm really delighted to join all of you as we celebrate the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory's 20th anniversary, at a time when I think all of us are focusing on the invaluable and irreplaceable contributions of universities and academic communities. I have been thinking a lot about the centrality of community to scholarly work. And 3CT embodies the really critical work of convening communities and conversations that open new ground and shed new light. So I'm very delighted that we have this occasion to reflect on that. In the 2 decades since its founding, 3CT has fostered discussion that is intellectually nimble, responsive to emergent issues, provocative, engaging, compelling. It's become an essential locus of interdisciplinary exploration for people early in their careers, for students, for faculty at all stages, and has brought to campus a really remarkable set of interlocutors from across disciplines and around the world. As the program for tonight and tomorrow illustrates, 3CT engages faculty not only in my division, in our division, the social sciences, but across campus, across humanistic fields, and again, across the world. The diversity of scholarship is evident, of course, in the 3CT fellows as well. The current cohort gathers 23 scholars whose intellectual interests and pursuits spark a remarkably broad, imaginative, and challenging set of discussions and collaborations. There are so many wonderful engagements, products, and discussions that 3CT has fostered over the years. I think of the Conspiracy Theory Project and the Reimagining Cosmopolitan Project as wonderful examples. And I also think of the discussions in this series that is entitled The Corporate University, that has done this really important work of critically examining the principles, governance, and mission of the University of Chicago at a time that is challenging for our institution and actually for all institutions. So as we take time to reflect on 3CT and its many accomplishments in its 20 years, one characteristic clearly emerges. 3CT sort of embodies lines of inquiry and approach to understanding the world in which we live, I think in a uniquely University of Chicago way. Deep discussion, no-nonsense discussion, and conversations that convene people across varied perspectives and fields. So I want to offer my congratulations to the faculty of 3CT, for Lisa Wedeen, who's been a remarkable leader, and to the students and staff that have made 3CT, helped it to thrive and continue to thrive into the future. I'm also, Lisa's going to introduce our speaker, but I want to thank Judith Butler for making the trip here. It's going to be extraordinary, kicking off an extraordinary event. So now it's my pleasure to welcome Lisa Wedeen, the Mary R. Morton Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Political Science and Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory.
Thank you, Dean Woodward, and thank you, Michael Kulma and Denise Jorgens of iHouse for helping us to host this event. On behalf of 3CT, I'm Lisa Wedeen, the director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 20th anniversary celebration. 3CT began as a collective in 2004 with a self-imposed mandate to theorize the present. Directed at the time by the anthropologist Jean Komaroff, our small group saw the need for an intellectual space devoted to new ways to analyze the contemporary without being presentist, to understand, for example, how capitalism operates in a post-Fordist era, how creative readings with and through the global South could illuminate chronic conundrums in fresh and salutary ways, how the world had outrun the vocabularies being used in scholarly discourse to describe it. The idea was to offer innovative conceptual repertoires in light of this felt deficiency. I was the only junior faculty member at the time, but at 3CT, I found a welcoming and intellectually enlivening community. Personally, theory has always been my life buoy. We're a larger collective now than we were then, with many more events and public-facing projects than we had when we started. Our longest-running series, Theorizing the Present, continues to feature scholars attempting to understand the contemporary moment. And over the years, we've had the privilege of welcoming to the center many eminent US-based and international thinkers. In the past decade, we've embarked on a number of fellow-initiated projects designed not as permanent fixtures, but to exist for several years. In May, for example, we will be celebrating the end of the Reimagining Cosmopolitanism project, generously co-sponsored by the Neubauer Collegium, with a large conference showcasing the edited volume that resulted. We're currently hosting a popular initiative on the corporate university that Professor Woodward mentioned, and we're embarking on a new project with colleagues from various universities around the world entitled Revolutionary Disappointment and Recalibration. These are just some of the projects in which members of our collective, an assertively interdisciplinary group, along with other colleagues from the interpretive social sciences and the humanities, are engaged. While 3CT's goal of theorizing the present remains intact, the world has changed since we were first established, of course. Some questions persist, such as how and in what ways theory is important to our present moment. And we continue to ask what kinds of philosophical ideas are best suited to diagnose our current situations and why. Yet, in the intervening period, the terms contemporary and present have emerged with different valences, inviting questions which will be addressed at the conference about our changing relation to the conceptual armatures we bring to events to make sense of them. Recognizing the rise of ultra-nationalist movements in Europe, Latin America, India, and the United States, and taking into account the defeat of calls for liberal democratic government in the Arab world, part of what it means now to theorize the present is to investigate the prevalent forms of and affective attachments to authoritarianism emerging worldwide. The present-day circumstances of violence, uncertainty, the ongoing threats of climate change, capitalism's resilience, and its capacity to produce new kinds of exploitation, precarity, and ideological buy-in. These are some of the themes that we are analyzing through our initiatives. At the same time, our remit is ultimately to abstract from these current events, to think about continuities and change, to cultivate novel modes of attunement, and to make a case for why theory matters in a world of devastation, exhaustion, and pain. Now, I want to speak for a moment as an individual as opposed to a representative of 3CT. It's my hope that people will come away from these 2 days of events with renewed energy, with the capacity to imagine an otherwiseness to contemporary circumstances, to experience intellectual solidarity while also treasuring the engaged disagreement inside our collegium, and to embrace those moments of opening and surprise when assumptions are unsettled or conventional ways of thinking questioned. And I hope that we, 3CT and the University of Chicago, can maintain our intellectual ferocity and autonomy in the face of this current onslaught on higher education. As well as disastrous, however, this onslaught is an opportunity to develop innovative modes of political judgment and novel diagnoses of the conditions and atmospheres that make justice and equity so elusive. It's also an occasion to speak truth with a small t to power, as a familiar phrase would have it, to answer calls to courage and to label the intentional mass killing of civilians by its name, genocide. These circumstances, so resonant with fascism, also demand examining the antecedent conditions that made possible this period of fear and foreboding, of disappearances from the streets, of mass deportations, of everyday complicities, collusion, sycophancy, and new rhetorics of disavowal. And finally, for the sake of future understanding, to explore the rage and fantasy investments, the gendered, class, and race-inflected revenant fury and enjoyment that all too regretfully demand theorization in our particular present, just now, in the gap between past and future, to borrow Hannah Arendt's felicitous phrase. Before introducing our speaker, I want to thank our staff for their superb work. It's no exaggeration to say that 3CT could not exist without the staff's labor and creativity. In particular, I would like to thank student assistants Lucy De Silva and Delaney Wallace, our program coordinator, Ryan Eckholt, and our indefatigably imaginative and extraordinary in every way associate director, Anna Searle-Jones. Please give them a hand. Enormous thanks are also owed to Judith Butler for their presence here tonight. It's common to say the speaker needs no introduction, but in this case, this is not a phrase of politesse, but just a fact. Butler is the closest thing to a theorist who is also a household name, and deservedly so. They have contributed to various kinds of public and academic debates, and they've grappled with political issues, conceptual problems, and social anxieties in ways that have found traction and recognition across various divides. Now for the more formal details in brief. Judith Butler is the Distinguished Professor in the Graduate School and formerly the Maxine Elliot Chair in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California at Berkeley. They are the author of numerous books, among which are the following, and I'm not doing justice. It's a really long list, so I'm not going to list them all. Subjects of Desire, Hegelian Reflections in 20th Century France, 1987. Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, 1990. Bodies That Matter, On the Discursive Limits of Sex, 1993. The Psychic Life of Power, Theories of Subjection, 1997. Excitable Speech, 1997. Precarious Life, Powers of Violence and Mourning, 2004. Frames of War, When is Life Grievable, 2009. Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, 2012. The Force of Nonviolence, 2020. And most recently, in 2024, Who's Afraid of Gender? They will be discussing this last work at Haymarket Books with an online option available this Monday at 7 p.m. Butler served as a founding director with Martin Jay at the Critical Theory program at UC Berkeley. They received a Mellon Foundation grant to establish and to develop the International Consortium of Critical Theory programs from 2016 to 20, where they now serve as co-chair of the board and editorial member of Critical Times. And they received a new Mellon grant this year on which 3CT is a proud collaborator. Entitled A Counter-Imaginary in Authoritarian Times, the grant brings artists and academics together to think through modalities for combating contemporary assaults on political life, on our very capacity to express ourselves through words and other kinds of action, on our ability to flourish in concert with others. Butler has also served in many administrative roles, including chairing the Modern Language Association's Committee on Academic Freedom and Professional Responsibilities, before serving as president of the MLA in 2020. Butler has also been active in several human rights organizations, including the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and the Advisory Board of Jewish Voices for Peace. They were the recipient of the Andrew Mellon Award for Distinguished Academic Achievement in the Humanities 2009-13 and received the Adorno Prize from the City of Frankfurt in honor of their contributions to feminist and moral philosophy. They have also been awarded the Brudner Prize from Yale University for lifetime achievement in gay and lesbian studies, and they are the recipient of numerous fellowships, including Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Ford, and the American Council of Learned Societies. I'm grateful, Judith, for your intellectual brilliance and integrity, as well as for your political camaraderie in these dreadful times. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Professor Judith Butler.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lisa, for your introduction and for making this possible. Thank you, Anna, as well, for making this possible, and iHouse and 3CT for being as brilliant and surprising as a program can be. So I've changed my mind several times about what to present today. And that seems to be how people are working now, right? The world suddenly, you've written something and then the world changes. And it's like, in early January, I started this paper commenting on the dread with which many of us live. I wonder now whether we're feeling dread, which carries a sense of foreboding, something yet to happen, or perhaps panic, the scattering of sense by events, by not knowing what it means, that assaults on protected freedoms, academic, constitutional, international, have happened and are happening now. Perhaps we are appalled, or perhaps even sick, or find ourselves falling or having fallen. Knowing without quite believing that the assault has begun on migrants, trans people, the undocumented, the partially documented, the students with visas who have committed no crime by taking public stands against genocide, against educational institutions. The assault, again, against educational institutions and government agencies themselves. institutions like Columbia University are, as you know or should know, they're under an obligation to prevent reprisals against members of their community who express their views publicly on principled grounds, especially when the principle is justice. But as they and other universities like UCLA and UPenn feed the names of protesters to the federal administration or the police or ICE voluntarily, they become the very instruments of reprisal they are meant to protect against. And every time they engage in such activity, becoming complicit, they help to build a new authoritarian consensus. I'll return to this issue of reprisal in my remarks today, because the willingness to retaliate or to let the government retaliate not only destroys the extramural protections that belong to academic freedom, but activates a set of fascist passions that call to be explored. I'll start by explaining what I mean by fascist passion, and then show the link, hopefully, between such passions and the destruction of a key component of academic freedom, that is, extramural speech, which is precisely the component of academic freedom that relates academic life to the ideals of the university and shows its contribution to democratic values. But first, a remark on the present moment, which, as we know, is altering at whatever moment we seek to describe or name it. When I've spoken to young people in recent months, and that's now a vast category, by the way, it gets vaster every year, they tell me that they fear the end of democracy, and others tell me they fear the end of the world. The forces of destruction they identify seem to be succeeding with inexorable pace. There are, however, several social and political movements that continue to strengthen during this time. The sanctuary networks for students and migrants that took shape in record time, the lawyers of all sorts contributing pro bono hours, already convincing courts to suspend compliance with at least 69 executive orders as of this date. Here, at least potentially, are some interconnected struggles outside the party system, but putting pressure on that system. They include struggles against racism, capitalism, and extractivism, against misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia, for gender freedoms and reproductive justice, struggles for affordable education and the forgiveness of debt, global struggles against imperial wars, transnational protests against genocide in Gaza, solidarities of care, again, the sanctuary networks transnationally, abolitionist politics, the solidarity and support for the anti-colonial Palestinian freedom movements, Jewish Voice for Peace and its allied organizations, Faculty and Students for Justice in Palestine, activism, legal and extra-legal, movements and organizations against climate catastrophe and environmental racism, 4, science research, exposing the failure of government to provide basic health services, shelters, and education to people, opposing privatization of social services and the destruction of social bonds and public goods. Just a few. I thought it might lift you up. At the same time, an authoritarianism in the U.S. is entrenching itself with speed and deliberation, backed by a breathtaking complicity of academic institutions and a range of government agencies and corporations who have redefined their social responsibility to serve state mandates, authorizing retaliation, assisting in arrests and deportations, imposing censorship, and the legal and existential destitution and violation of some of the most vulnerable and courageous communities in this country. A year ago, I was among those who did not anticipate how intensely the authoritarian upsurge would be, even though I had published on the anti-gender ideology movement's exploitation of hateful passions that were only satisfied by greater state control and authoritarian attacks on a range of communities exposed to legal and non-legal violence. In the US, we did not speak about gender ideology in the mainstream press until relatively recently. Gender studies scholars knew it was an issue elsewhere, but only within certain evangelical corners of the US did it seem to be here. That situation changed in the campaign for the election, where robocalls reached the eligible voting public in the days before the vote, which included warnings that Harris, if elected, would promote trans surgery for migrants. Elon Musk has been credited with this overwhelming social media campaign. Such calls were examples of how right-wing phantasms work to incite fears that convert into hatred and popular support for authoritarian leaders who claim to be able to restore a so-called natural order in which gender, or rather sex, remains immutably binary and hierarchical. Indeed, authoritarian strategies not only target academic fields, ethnic studies, feminist and gender studies, critical race theory as shorthand for all Black studies or all anti-racist studies, but cultural institutions, including nonprofits that are viewed as promoting left agendas, and all those now fear eradication or the loss of tax exemptions that will lead to insolvency. Indeed, the Trump campaign circulated phantasm of Harris promoting, prescribing, or arranging for trans surgery on migrant populations brings together anxiety about trans life, including gender-affirming care for trans youth, trans people in sports, legal sex change that sons and daughters may elect to pursue, and fears that migrants are stealing jobs, part of a great replacement theory, eating pets in small towns, and further darkening white America. The phantasm produces an amalgamated threat to something called America, thereby allowing multiple anxieties to be sutured together and redirected toward communities, now understood as targets, who are said to be the reason why people fear for the future, experience instability, or suffer from unlivable wages or unpayable debt. Even if the anxieties were not already there, the circulated phantasms give them life and new form, providing a link among different progressive agendas for those fearful that Harris, if elected, would impose a new left order. No leftist was under the illusion that she would do any of that. She was never the ideal candidate. Weak labor politics, support for fracking, the police, border controls, prisons. That as we think about the power of this kind of messaging, we see that Harris is implicitly cast as an elite coastal woman of color. And the message links that figure with two kinds of social anxieties, amalgamating racism, sexism, anti-intellectualism, trans life, and migrants. We should pull ourselves together as well as they pull us together. The phantasmatic scene in this robocall, for instance, is preposterous and untrue, but that hardly matters. In fact, its unreality is part of its power. The phantasmatic scene follows its own syntax, one that Freud uncovered in his interpretation of dreams. It is ordered by the displacement of existing fears onto new objects, the condensation of existing anxieties, and the projection of acts that will be committed that deflect from the operation of authoritarian power precisely at the moment when it broadens its reach and cultivates popular support and consensus. We may say that the example I've just given is but the cultural manifestation of an ongoing structural or economic issue, and that would be partially right. But can the structure reproduce itself without such excitable examples? The excitable example speaks to the question of why people are mobilized or mobilize themselves to show up in droves to reinstall Trump in the Oval Office. Can we do this without understanding what grips them at the level of fear and desire? This is, I would suggest, best approached through a psychosocial framework, historically situated, for it pertains to how people live their economic precarity and their very sense of the future. That is surely one reason why Juliet Mitchell rightly warned in Women's Estate, 1970, that economic reductionism will never adequately explain women's oppression or any other oppression, and that the political conditions of psychic formations will have to be part of any Marxist feminism moving forward, a point Fanon already knew. The psychosocial domain is crucial for what we desire and fear. What grips our imagination is not produced by psychic life alone. That psychic life is not only socially conditioned, but pervaded by social and political powers. We're not the simple effect of those powers, no, but the psyche and the passions are places where we register and contend with political and social realities, the forms and effects of their impingement, the way they saturate the psyche and take shape within passions whose origins we can give no ready account. For which? Fascist passions. I think we cannot understand what's happening as so many countries move in right-wing directions without first understanding fascist passions. These are not necessarily passions for fascism, but forms of excitation that result in support for regimes that step-by-step establish authoritarianism at the expense of legally established freedoms and rights. Each step is applauded, and every new step is anticipated. The fear is itself exciting for some, as it is when Milei in Argentina claims that all social structures will be destroyed and radical austerity will ensue, and then the crowd cheers with unchecked enthusiasm. There is no easy structural or mechanical way to explain this kind of passion. I have three theses to be pursued here. First, fascist passions now take the form of a moralized form of sadism, that is, forms of destructive, life-extinguishing violence or negligence, and right stripping that are supported by justificatory schemes that take the form of morality or that draw upon or build moral convictions. Two, politics in dark times, such as those in which we live, cannot proceed without a counter-imaginary, a passionate vision that rivals and defeats the moralized sadism of fascist passions and their phantasmatic landscape. Three, necessary for any such counter-imaginary is the idea of the equal grievability of all lives, including human and animal life, and the living processes of the earth. I had to take that part out today, but we can talk about it. This last thesis both contains and exceeds anthropocentrism as it extends to endangered creatures, life forms, and life processes. Opposed to death-dealing, rights stripping, and activities fueled by fascist passions and their organizing phantasms, the counter-imaginary would affirm the equal value of the living and form the basis of a politics of radical equality and collective life affirmation, preservation, repair, and regeneration. Recently, political passions that are potentially fascist seem to be those which correspond with the willingness to see the rights, freedoms, and even the lives of people destroyed without intervening. A passion is not the same as a desire. A passion is undergone, indicating a level of passivity or yielding, even a captivation, or a way of being held captive, not by an external force, but by what we might call the force of fantasy. A passion is also a form of suffering, as we know from its religious history and etiology. A passion grips and moves, belying motives that are not always clearly knowable or easily stopped. The other word, fascist, has many histories and has been approached, as you know, through competing typologies over decades. I know sometimes the use of the term fascist can seem too quick, functioning more as a verbal expression of outrage than as a precise description. If we do not yet have state fascism, which would arguably be supported by extensive police powers, or if what happens now is not the same as the kinds of fascism that have come before, it hardly follows that we should not speak of a set of fascist trends at work today in several parts of the globe. I want to argue that to identify and oppose such trends and passions, we first must track the incendiary phantasms that draw upon and restructure such passions, the phantasms around which such passions cluster, becoming condensed sites of excitability. It will not be enough to analyze them in a convincing manner, although we surely must do that. Sooner rather than later, we will have to counter them with passions of our own, producing counter-trends and counter-imaginaries that are not only right and justified, but compelling and even irresistible. Passion can hardly be defeated by a good argument, even though a good argument is part of the mix. Actually, it was Kierkegaard who taught me that. The passion to see others suffer and lose their place in the world, however, can only be countered by a desire, a stronger desire, to live with others in a place that honors the equal power and freedom to live. For that to happen, we would have to know what it is that drives me to the meeting, that motivates me to show up, that rouses in me the desire to act. I do not have only myself in mind, but this self as a kind of connective tissue, a dynamic position within shared life. The principles we embrace are not realizable without imagining the world that would embody those principles. And that means embodying the principles ourselves, in our practices, our discourses, and in whatever institutions and spaces we have the chance to build. That said, I want to suggest that fascist passions these days are directed against vulnerable communities more broadly and are concerned with stripping people of their rights, including people huddled at the border or living under occupation, trans and queer people, non-binary, intersex, of basic legal rights. Anti-fascist passions are those that seek to realize cohabitation on the condition of equality, open borders, demilitarization, and forms of radical democracy that move beyond classical liberal assumptions. It would include a notion of radical equality that would move us beyond the nation and nationhood and toward transnational solidarities. And it would be a form of radical equality not based on the individual as a basic unit, but rather on interdependency with implications for how human creatures relate to the earth as an internally variegated and living organism. But the passions I'm calling fascist right now, they take on, I would suggest, for the most part, not always, a strangely moral dimension, which is not to say that they are morally justified. They are not. They assume a moral form as they further immoral acts of destruction. And yet many of those who are run by such passions, or who incite and circulate such passions, understand the harm they are doing as morally right or necessary. So when I say they are moral, I am describing a moral character to these passions, what some may prefer to call moralized, to avoid confusion. The moral form of expression, which includes moral self-righteousness, retribution, even vengeance, can, under certain circumstances, operate as a justification for doing harm. For instance, when crowds mobilize against migration and for mass deportation, they understand themselves as doing good, insofar as they're seeking to restore the good life and to ward off a possible harm, the harm that migrants are said to do, or the harmful force they are imagined to be. It's not the case that those I'm prepared to call fascists do harm and then afterwards supply a moral justification for having done so. No, they often understand themselves as not doing harm at all, never having done, as only doing good, since they are keeping the harmful forces, sometimes called the demonic forces, away. And as they engage in active rights stripping or in calls for and practices of fatal abandonment, they articulate a restoration fantasy, for a former social order functions as an ideal that they recall and seek to achieve, even if that order never existed. Sometimes their argument goes further. The only way to restore the good life or an ideal sense of the good social order is precisely through right stripping or practices of fatal abandonment in relation to excluded, abased, and marginalized communities. These are privative measures that must be taken, the argument goes, to achieve or restore the good life, fueled by a furious nostalgia or a sense of justifiable retribution. Or sometimes they are undertaken, these acts, in the name of the good itself. This point of view positions those who strip away rights and promote forms of fatal abandonment or murderous bombardment as defenders of the good, keeping the tide of destruction at bay. To the extent that these kinds of life-damaging or life-dispensing measures are conceived as preconditions of the good life or of its restoration, then the very act of taking rights away or denying a life the possibility of life and legal status become good deeds, moral activities that understand themselves as realizing the good at the very moment that they perpetrate social damage. If one understands the harm one is doing to be morally right, to be justified in advance, to be doing good, or bringing back the good, then whatever one does in the service of realizing that end would seem to be justified. It seems so, however, only if the means are justified by the ends, and if both are renamed in such a way that the argument can unfold as it does. The stripping of rights is thus seen not as an assault on democracy or basic rights, but rather as a means for realizing the greater good. The justification depends on a successful renaming practice. However, some who are in favor of stripping people of basic rights do not require a moral justification for doing so. After all, if one's harmful action has been renamed as good, or as serving the good, then there's no need to justify the harm. It is, by definition, good. It's already undergone a transvaluation and simply appears as good, as the right thing to do. The harm is, under such conditions, not viewed as a harm at all. We can thus tentatively distinguish between those who offer a moral justification for doing harm and those who understand that what they are doing, the harm they are doing, is already good. The first requires an instrumental argument that seeks to rename harm as good. The second assumes that the transvaluation accomplished by the first has already happened and that harm has effectively become good. The instrumental framework presumes that a justification is necessary. Harm must be done for the good, for a good society to be restored. That good society is ordered and hierarchical and often brings with it the support for patriarchal, white supremacist, nationalist, classist, or transphobic forms of discrimination and disempowerment. In the second instance, harm has effectively been renamed as good, and with a full transvaluation of values accomplished, the conversion of harm into good becomes normalized and needs no justification. In addition, that conversion or transvaluation proves to be, frankly, exciting for those under its sway. Well, how does excitement enter here? The excitement of doing harm in the name of the good engages the thrill of transgressing moral principles, becoming liberated, as it were, from traditional moral constraints, and finally becoming authorized to act destructively with the full conviction, a conviction accomplished over time through building a lethal consensus, that one's action is actually right or good, that it restores good to the world, or that it makes a bad world good again, or great again. And that, paradoxically, it safeguards the world against its possible destruction. So when Viktor Orban claims that gender threatens to destroy civilization itself, he's implicitly citing the Vatican, which has already likened gender to an atomic bomb, the Ebola virus, a threat to nature, man, and civilization itself. When Trump, for instance, calls for mass deportation of migrant workers and communities, millions, he says, the largest ever, he is seeking to purify the nation, but also to return it to a time that never was, a time that is situated in a phantasmatic locality. It's not only that he seeks to preserve and purify the nation, drawing on the furious nostalgia of white supremacism, he's also promising a spectacle larger than any large deportation we have known, larger than any sense of the large we might formerly have had. which means that he's not only defying imagination, but promising a transport into a fascist sublime. I've suggested that, at least in some cases, there's a moral form or sheen to contemporary fascism, or some of it, that's bound up with an ideal of return, the moral imperative through which a restoration fantasy operates. I distinguished between fascist ideals that make use of forms of justification that accomplish a transvaluation of terms, and those that accept that transvaluation as already complete and effective, and therefore in need of no further justification. By claiming that each of these are forms of fascism with a moral cast or sheen, I do not mean that either are morally justified, not at all. But they do deploy the appearance of moral justification, occupying the language of morality to do harm. When the call to do harm, as if it were doing good, depends upon a plausible description of the threat to the nation or social order that must be averted, hyperbole functions within political discourse to enlarge the threat to civilization, to white supremacist and transphobic social orders, for instance. A grand battle is undertaken, a spectacle larger than any previous one, promising a form of destruction either beyond all sense of destruction we have known or equal to the worst forms we have seen or remembered. The millions that Trump threatened to deport, even before taking office, the demonic character of gender that targets trans, non-binary, and intersex people, reproductive rights, sexual and gender health services, and research into sexuality and sex, effectively enshrined in the anti-gender ideology executive order of January 20th, all of these are meant to produce an excited anticipation of an ever fresher spectacle of human wreckage, including the public denial of the very existence of trans people, the criminalization of dissent, and the captivating stories of expulsions happening now, and against those who have engaged in protests or speech affirming Palestinian freedom. This excitement, which I've also called a captivation, can take the form of a celebration of shameless cruelty, one that is released of both the instrumental moral framework and the one that assumes that what some have called harm is now firmly transvalued as good. So there's a third instance here, shameless sadism. It dispenses with the moral cast of fascism and roots itself in the thrill of transcending all traditional and contemporary moral and political constraints. The various overstatements are part of fascist transgression, constituting a verbal spectacle of vitriolic hyperbole. We're asked to watch the impossible utterance as it is displayed, and we're meant to thrill to the courage of the one who shamelessly speaks, untethered from any standards of truth and falsehood, doing good or doing harm. These are politicians who engage in hyperbole and untruth without hiding that fact at all. It won't do to simply say that these are uneducated people who come to believe what politicians say, the people who support them, or who lack the criteria for distinguishing between valid and invalid statements of fact, or the capacity to distinguish moral values correctly. No, it's people from various educational backgrounds who stand in awe of the speaker's willingness to exaggerate and dispense with defensible claims and criteria of truth in public on the media. It's exciting to see someone lie with impunity before the world. Perhaps the strong man at the center of fascist appeal is the one who can happily incite others to watch the lie as it operates its powers of incitation and capture. The self-exposure of the liberated liar is part of the spectacle at hand. The people who support him are not duped. The excitation depends on knowing it's a lie and thrilling at its shameless public display and reiteration. This shameless iteration of fascist passion cannot be explained through recourse to hypocrisy or concealment. The media exposure of the one willing to lie in public is part of the thrill. We may be used to political ruses, euphemisms, and forms of hypocrisy, authorities who say, oh, what I'm doing now is not really violence, but legitimate force used by the state to defend itself. Or perhaps people say that whatever happened was not violence, but a way of defending the rights of that delimited class of persons who rightly deserve to have those rights. So there, a territorial and exclusionary logic delimits those who have the right to self-defense from those who have neither that right nor the status of rights-bearing subjects. Violence is not justified by the right of self-defense, but renamed and re-perceived as self-defense. Recent defenders of unleashing police and ICE agents against student protesters have renamed their practices to deflect from or negate the state violence inflicted upon people who are, after all, exercising constitutionally protected rights of speech and assembly. Those who unleash the police and ICE agents against them are doing violence, facilitating violence, and rights stripping at the same time. The arguments they give in their defense provide a new rationale for state violence, but seek to normalize the conversion of one name into another. It's a transvaluation that corresponds with the practice of rebranding and the neoliberal conceit that any damaged good can be sold again under a new rubric, that something that appears one way can be made to appear another way for the purposes of self-interest or self-defense. Replacing state violence with legitimate force often reintroduces harm as the good, giving a perpetrated moral form or cast, perhaps moral sheen, to that renamed violence. Maybe this could be understood as moralized rebranding. Similarly, the Israeli rationale for state-sponsored death dealing became reissued in a new name, such as self-defense, which was then elaborated as a right, distinguished by its denial of that right's universality and reciprocity. The right to self-defense takes place by appealing to its universality. We say, well, every country has the right to self-defense. Don't you agree? Yes, yes. And yet, Palestinians have no such right, and their rights of, because there are no rights of political self-determination, that is, the condition for becoming a subject of rights who could lay claim to the right of self-defense. It is denied by the very territorial claims that exclude them from citizenship or deny themselves self-determination, deny them self-determination within the boundaries of the Israeli state, at least for those who are not citizens of the state of Israel and those who have limited forms of citizenship, especially since 2018. The limits thus placed on universalization serve as a condition for the exercise of so-called universal rights, that is, the universal right of self-defense. The ostensibly universal right of self-defense is built through a discourse of moralization and universalization. Anyone who would question this language would be nearly immediately rejected as someone who rejects universality and morality alike. Indeed, Francesca Albanese has made the case that self-defense, now used by the Israeli state, has been, as its justification for violence and death dealing, has been precisely the legal way in which it has built the case for the genocidal intent of its own military actions. In other words, it has cloaked and furthered genocidal intent. The defensible use of force becomes the alibi for an indefensible genocidal onslaught. The self-contradiction that belongs to this particular legal discursive practice is then relocated externally, culminating in the accusation that those who object to the contradiction as a ruse for attacking the foundations of democratic life. In the past, we were able to respond to this kind of maneuver by calling it hypocrisy or a lie, by attempting to expose its ruse, seeking recourse to radical journalism or radical lawyers, social movements, various platforms to get the truth out. But when shameless sadism becomes the defining feature of fascist passion, that very exposure is a condition of its captivating power, intensifying its effect, even consolidating its power. So genocide can happen in broad daylight on television for everyone to see. And there is no justification other than an idea of self-defense that can expand to include every possible genocidal act. So we're already in a thicket. I began with the proposition that perhaps there's a new kind of fascism that brings with it its own fascist passions. And then I pointed out that an older political scenario is one that is more familiar, but no longer working. The older one has to do with hypocrisy and dissimulation. I gave some examples about how language and rebranding work to selectively invoke international law and to moralize certain kinds of mass killing as justifiable. I then tried to distinguish between instrumental forms of justification that accomplish the conversion of harm into good and those that depend upon that accomplishment, treated as a naturalized way of being. I then introduced a third dimension, released from the second, namely that of shameless sadism, defined in part by the shared sadistic thrill it produces in transcending or destroying moral constraints, or in lying in public happily. Well, how precisely does sadism figure in this account of fascist passions? Well, I want to suggest that for the first two modes, we can use the term moral sadism to describe the way that sadism becomes permitted and amplified through a moral justification. For Melanie Klein, moral sadism usually is understood as the violence that the superego inflicts upon the ego, one that seeks to stop the unbridled expression of sadistic impulses, but can only do it through a sadistic restriction. And yet moral sadism, externalized, not only permits that expression, but casts it as a moral necessity. In the first instance, superegoic violence is meant to forestall violence. In the second, violence is renamed as morality and unleashed as a moral force. The moral sadist causes harm, even kills, under the rubric of a moral justification, or the justification becomes a further iteration of sadism itself. The justification operates in many ways. It produces a cover for violence, but also an instrument, and it shields the violent power from moral recrimination. Those against whom moral sadism acts are the ones who deserve this violence because they are considered immoral, and indeed, in its racist forms, they are often cast as the embodiment of violence itself. Retribution and reprisal become forms of moral sadism. The inversion is in many ways splendid to behold for the twists and turns and the perfect circularity of its path, but it is also clearly horrific, since it is not just that a moral justification for violence precedes and authorizes violence, it is also the case that morality is effectively achieved in the violent act, which means we have lost morality. This form of power is still very much with us, but the other one might be said to be more contemporary and atavistic, and that's the production and circulation of shameless sadism that has no need of the moral or legal alibi. Indeed, the exhilaration that accompanies shameless sadism, which is distinct from moral sadism in Klein's sense, is linked to the fact that shameless sadism advances through a display of its contempt for legal and moral restriction more generally. It shows not only that it is against the law and in that sense criminal, but beyond the law and in that sense manic or maniacal. At the same time, it makes use of the law to rationalize its genocides or right stripping, and more generally treats the law as a pure instrument, not so much to justify its actions than to accomplish its violence. This is one reason we are seeing authoritarians elected through democratic elections, since those who support them are excited by the promises of mass deportation, moralized murder, and incarceration at the border. Let's consider the paradox of shameless sadism, articulated as racism, xenophobia, and transphobia, instrumentalizing the apparatus of democratic institutions to defeat democratic aspirations. Shameless sadism can be seen in explicit calls for mass deportations, right stripping, the amplification of militarized police powers trained to attack those who exercise rights of expression, mobility, affiliation, and assembly, that oppose the above-mentioned forms of violent state powers, or criticize foreign policy, or oppose investments in industries producing military and surveillance technology for, say, the Israeli checkpoints, the demolition of homes, the appropriation of land, and bombardment and genocide. Alberto Toscano, in his book, Late Fascism, maintains, and I quote, "Fascism is not just the apotheosis of the leader above the sheep-like masses of his followers," end quote. It's this microphysics of everyday terrors, oh, this is still his language, this elemental affective structure that connects previous manifestations of fascism in Europe and elsewhere with the late fascisms of today. Toscano describes his position this way, again, quoting, "What we call fascism cannot be reduced to the ideologies and political regimes that defined it in the Europe of the 1930s and 40s because it is primarily a type of desire, an eros, or what I would call an affective disposition, a propensity to make the body act in a particular way," end quote. Toscano identifies what is historically specific and novel about today's late fascism. He writes, "It is both a reaction against certain facets of the neoliberal moment, those to be coded and sometimes racialized as globalist, and a passionate over-identification with the coercive dimensions of the anti-state state," end quote. This reactive passion is consistently framed from the United States to Argentina as a righteous struggle for freedom, which, coded in a fascist fashion, is basically the freedom to dominate racialized others and impose legitimate violence on them. This sad passion for freedom is parallel to a profoundly visceral disgust at equality, or in the words of Toscano, a repulsion for solidarity, care, vulnerability, end quote. And yet, I want to ask, is it right to say that those passions must be understood as permutations of desire? I want to suggest that the excitement that accompanies a reactionary liberation from both law and morality, through its terms or without them, is something quite different. And here I put liberation in quotation marks. Less the satisfaction of desire than a moralized occasion for unbridled sadism. And sadism, Freud tells us, draws upon the death drive, a compulsion that cannot be easily explained through the economy of desire. The superegoic restraint on unbridled sadism assumes social and political form in sovereignty, law, and regulations. But if those very institutions and practices come to serve the quest of the death drive, then authority can easily permit the murder it is expected to constrain. What follows is not only the decimation of guilt, understood as the reflexive operation of the superego, but the falling away of moral self-recrimination. Perhaps with the falling away of shame. Perhaps there's no shame because the one before whom shame would be possible, the generalized space of the other, has already been eliminated. Exposure, public exposure, is thus not a problem, but rather a condition for amplifying power. The central conceit of investigative reporting assumes that governments and agencies will be shamed or held accountable, that they'll fear reputational damage if they fail to protect the fundamental rights of people. But in fact, none of that seems to be the case in the new order. One could seek recourse to rationalization to explain what is happening, arguing that, well, some people do harm and then supply a moral justification for having done so. In that case, they would be devious or hypocritical. But the contemporary situation is actually worse. Once they understand themselves as not doing harm at all, but rather doing good, or as engaging in just forms of retribution against those who would destroy society, they come to conceive of right stripping or fatal abandonment as activities that will help to restore a social order, and it is a social order they believe they have lost and to which they understand themselves to be entitled. When harmful acts are conceived as instrumental to achieving that end, then the measures are simply preconditions of the good life, of its restoration, and the very act of taking rights away or denying a group of people the possibility of life and legal status becomes good deed, an activity that realizes the good while doing away with the conditions of livable life for some. The successful transvaluation accomplished by the instrumental justification of harm and violence is itself a thrill, but to understand the thrills of deportation and dispossession, we have to see the distortion of moral justification in the service of fascist rebranding, one that produces a platform for the excited overcoming of all morality in the service of sadistic powers. Moralized sadism institutes the conditions for sadistic excitement that display its own impunity and liberation from moral and political constraints. Some could argue, well, sadism, doesn't that just belong to the human psyche itself? Some would say aggression better names that primary tendency from which sadism emerges. Fascist passions, however, are historically conditioned forms of sadism, thus raising the question of the conditions of its appeal and the mechanisms of its incitation. In the final part of this paper, and thank you for being patient with me, I want to address fascist passions in higher education. So how do fascist passions work in the context of the current assault on higher education? Let's recall that academic freedom consists not only in the right of faculty to design and teach their courses as they see fit, drawing on their training and credentials, but participating as faculty in structures of self-governance and engaging in extramural speech without fear of reprisal. The meaning and limits of extramural speech, conceived as part of academic freedom, have become important precisely now at the moment of their potential destruction. The Canadian Association of University Teachers claims that it, quote, implicates faculty expression that is not expressly connected to academic expertise nor to one's position within the institution, end quote. In other words, faculty untrained in certain areas are still free to opine about those areas outside the classroom without intervention or reprisal. They further remark that this freedom is linked to the general right of all citizens to express their views, although they do not elaborate on what that link is. They concede that extramural speech is often confused with the Canadian Charter right to freedom of expression, just as in this country, extramural speech is often confused with the constitutional right to free expression. But extramural academic freedom isn't just freedom of expression. It's a specific protection prohibiting universities and colleges from acting against academics for their political expression. Okay, so what is specific about extramural speech, or rather the protections that extramural speech are supposed to have, is that it obligates administrators not to seek reprisal against faculty who express themselves, and not to permit others, donors, external forces, governments, to enact reprisal either. Let's remember, academic freedom, at least as the AAUP follows it, and that's not the only way to follow it, is a right that belongs to faculty members. But it also, I would suggest, to the extent that it allows faculty members to conduct conversations on campus and be part of campus discussions without fearing for reprisal, it implies that students are there, that staff are there, that the entire campus community should be protected, even though that is not an explicit protection of academic freedom. It should be, because if we say faculty should not suffer reprisal for engaging in campus discussions are essential to the university as we know them, and if campus discussions include students and staff, and again, essential to the university as we know it, then students and staff should be equally protected. That is the argument. If it's not made, it should be made. So extramural protections are in fact those that administrations are charged with upholding, which means administrators have a distinct obligation to prevent colleagues from suffering reprisal from external forces or indeed from their own misuse of power. Now, of course, a serious problem emerges when someone takes political stands outside the walls of the classroom, extramural, and is consequently imagined to espouse those same views in the classroom. In such a case, an imagined link substitutes for any demonstrable claim, and the attribution is taken to be true rather than an unfounded allegation concocted for instrumental reasons. That was the argument made against Stephen Salaita, who was denied a position at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana after a series of tweets by him opposing the bombardment of Gaza in 2014. They were brought to light, and some argued that those tweets should be considered to be an extension of his academic knowledge of the field, and that it could be inferred from those tweets that this is the way this guy is going to teach in the classroom, and we can't possibly have him in the classroom. And of course, what that did was use an extramural example as demonstrating what his intramural practice would be, even though there was no corroborating evidence that his intramural, that is to say his classroom activities, in fact included expressions of that kind. His case has prefigured an increasing number of cases of suspension and termination on such grounds that have only proliferated in recent months. And as you know, the current federal administration has permitted and facilitated the abduction and detention of student organizer Mahmoud Khalil on March 8th of this year. But Danny Shaw was also fired from his faculty position at City University of New York after 18 years of service after a vicious spate of online harassment. Amin Hussein was fired from New York University after being interrogated on his statements that were considered anti-Zionist, a case that shows the full damage of the overbroad International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition that includes anti-Zionism not just as an instance of anti-Semitism, but as a paradigm for understanding what anti-Semitism is. This is a horrible travesty against the history of anti-Semitism. We need to be able to say when things are anti-Semitic and oppose them as such. But we can't do that if we have overbroad definitions that are being deployed for political purposes of censorship. Following an alumni letter that garnered 6,000 signatories in November 2023, Muhlenberg College terminated tenured Professor Maura Finkelstein from her position in the Department of Anthropology for retweeting a post that the college newspaper reported as expressing pro-Palestinian speech. Professor Mohammed Abdu was terminated at Columbia. Professor Catherine Franke was investigated and pushed into retirement by Columbia for extramural expressions she made. The situation is hardly helped by the fact that the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, in its review of the Finkelstein termination, and let's remember this was already under the Biden regime, maintained that social media posts by a professor outside the classroom can create a hostile environment for students, thereby preventing them from benefiting fully from a school's educational programs. This reverse passage over the wall that distinguishes extra from intramural is based on an imagined relationship between the two that first appears in the attribution and the allegation. Indeed, it may be that's the only place it appears. This fearful and malicious conjecture takes up the position where demonstrable evidence has vanished. The vitiation of evidence through persecutory imaginings, or we might say fantasy, is one way that legal protections can be destroyed, especially when that way of imagining effectively becomes a consensus. Instead of serving democratic ideals, universities engaging in such practices solicit or bow to state intervention and even shamelessly boast of their retaliatory powers to placate authorities, including donors and governments, with the power to stabilize the institution's financial future. And now that federal authorities are demanding reprisal against faculty and students for having espoused political positions that should be protected from reprisal, we see administrations often ready to crush their obligation of extramural protection to appease the federal government and keep their funds. They prefer the federal government prefers non-tenured targets, students and adjuncts, for they are unprotected by academic freedom, which is, strictly speaking, a faculty right. but whose extramural rights to debate issues on campus implies that student and staff are able to do the same. This is precisely the kind of external intervention into campus decisions regarding faculty, their units, their employment, that extramural protections were meant to protect against. Indeed, as the social responsibility of universities becomes increasingly equated with fiscal responsibility, administrators now sometimes say that enacting retaliation against those who have engaged in protests or speech affirming Palestinian freedom is their social and public responsibility. That's the way to keep their funds. The metonymies are quick and fatal. Support for Palestine is made equivalent to terrorist sympathizing, and no distinction is made between those who seek justice, freedom, and equality for Palestine without anti-Semitic sentiment or action, and those whose slogans are indeed offensive and anti-Semitic. To be for Palestine is to make the Jewish people feel unsafe, it is said. But which Jewish people are being represented by such a claim? And why is it that Christian nationalists in the Project Esther, authored by the same Heritage Foundation that gave us Project 2025, claimed that it is important to crush all Palestinian protest because they, the Christian nationalists, have to save the Jewish people from the recurrence of anti-Semitism. They've been anti-Semites since day one. Indeed, they claim that there's something now called a Hamas support network, and that everyone who's in the encampments or protesting is part of this vast Hamas support network. Well, such a network does not exist, except in the moment and as an effect of the allegation itself, right? So the allegation produces the phenomenon. It's another renaming or bringing a name into being that suddenly unifies everyone. There's no distinction between saying the end of occupation, the end of the war in Gaza, equal citizenship, and the removal of all Jews from the land. It's like, wait. Many criticisms are within the Zionist framework. Some are against the Zionist framework. Some that are against the Zionist framework are nonviolent and hope for an equal condition of cohabitation for all the people in the land. Do we want to hear and learn about the history of Zionism and anti-Zionism as part of Jewish life? Do we want to understand how many different political positions there are among Palestinians, or even what Hamas is as an organization? Are we allowed to ask that in public without being a Hamas sympathizer? I've already been accused, so I can speak. I'm free in a way. Right, it's already been established. It's already, I'm like a reigning Jewish lesbian member, In any case, whatever I am, non-binary, whatever. But the thing is that it's like, as the Heritage Foundation decides that we do not need to make distinctions, right, among those who are appalled by, whatever you want to call it, the slaughter, the genocide in Gaza. Everybody who stands up and tries to stop that, right? You could be a pacifist, anti-militarist, of socialist, with a good socialist feminist history. You could be showing up at that demo. You are a Hamas sympathizer because you have said something that is in favor of Palestine. Palestine is itself anti-Semitic. Palestine is now an anti-Semitic word. So this Hamas network, as it were, what is it called again? Hamas support network, which is made up at the moment of allegation, comes into being publicly as a discursive effect at the moment of the allegation, is precisely the same, not as consequential probably as gender ideology. Is there such a thing? Could we find it? Could we describe it? I'd say no, it doesn't exist. What about critical race theory? Well, that does exist, but it remains largely unread, inflated, distorted, and caricatures by those who seek to drive all matters of race outside the academy. I'm almost done. The federal government seeks now to substitute administrative obligations to protect extramural speech for faculty against reprisal with an obligation to enact those very forms of reprisal and retaliation as a sign of fidelity to the government. The protections against state interference have only become weaker as the threat to withdraw federal funds lures administrations into destroying those protections of both academic freedom and constitutionally protected speech. But when both the extramural speech of faculty and the free speech of students and staff are attacked or destroyed, or when whole disciplines are targeted or dismantled, open debate on campus, which, by the way, links extramural speech with constitutional speech, and freedom of inquiry, the ideal of the university, become radically chilled, if not frozen, and retaliation becomes an accepted term, even in some odd way, a responsibility of the institution for its fiscal health, or an obligation to the state, which means that a retaliatory passion or a vengeful politics demands the display of the crushing of rights for existing citizens, the revoking of visas for international students, abduction, detention, deportation of students and lecturers. And when university policies commit the injustice of allowing unfounded allegations to serve as pretext for suspension, termination, detention, or deportation, then a curiously brutal legal situation emerges worthy of Kafka. Protections for both due process, part of shared governance, by the way, and extramural speech are overridden and deconstituted in the name of following the law, or the executive mandate, or the governmental order, or the ransom note written on presidential letterhead. And when those exceptions start to proliferate, producing a kind of negative constellation or chain of precedents, perhaps even a counter law in the name of law, then unfounded conjecture and allegations, structured by phantasmatic staging and excitation, comes to reign. Unfounded allegation becomes then the basis for normalizing retaliation, for normalizing reprisal, and holding those who still honor extramural protections, holding them to be weak or as complicit with the crime, protecting those Hamas supporters, or as failing their public responsibility, jeopardizing the university's budget. Much more can be said about the extramural. You'll have noticed that this speaking here, the one I'm doing now, is a bit of extramuraling. That's what's happening. But so too is public speech that seeks to explain what we do in universities to the broader public so that we gain support for the kinds of knowledge we pursue. We pass through the wall, distinguishing intra and extra, to make the case for the university itself. And there's no more important time to explain the aims and values, say, of Middle Eastern studies programs than when they are being maligned and defamed. Public universities have to do this all the time for state legislators and donors, but all of us have to defend the public good of universities during a time in which they are cast as destroying the order of society rather than building a more expansive and informed public. Universities can invoke principles of neutrality, some of them around here do, that vacate the public and democratic promise of universities, but what a time to do that. They're sacrificing their contribution to society and to democracy by doing so. Equally, they can invoke fiscal responsibility as the only possible sense of responsibility that they are required to heed, welcoming state interference, crushing ideals of higher education in the name of a neoliberal metric. I've suggested here that extramural protections impose an obligation on administrations to practice self-restraint in light of the prospect of reprisal. The extramural dimension of academic freedom secures the freedom to live and speak without fear for those on campus. And once extramural protections are destroyed, everyone lives with fear. The fear of reprisal and retribution that belong to what many have called a new politics of vengeance undertaken by the executive power. This is, I would suggest to you, a form of shameless sadism, breaking the law in the name of the law for all to see. And it works in part because people do fear it, but also because of the excited support it gleans from those who admire shameless forms that sadism now takes. If a politics of retribution against enemies, both real and imagined, is at work in the draconian demands made of institutions to enact reprisal against its own students, faculty, and staff, then the obligations that keep inquiry and speech free are destroyed, establishing universities as sites where freedom is unlearned. Lastly, the distinction between intra and extramural speech depends upon the figure of a wall, which I address in a much longer version of this talk. If there's an inside and an outside, then there is some infrastructural component that divides the two, that provides the scene and setting for this discussion, a wall, a building. We know that some educational programs are fully extramural because there are no buildings. Extension courses, campuses built on extension models are all fully extramural. There's learning, it's online, but no building and sometimes no address. The ability to call for the restitution of college programs that have been destroyed, or the rebuilding of universities, or the creation of higher education institutions for the first time, all require extramural speech. They are calls for, well, the floor, the window, the ceiling, the entrance, the exit that many of us take for granted as the enduring infrastructural conditions of educational life. To call for a wall for the infrastructural conditions of education and academic freedom alike is itself a form of extramural speech, a call seeking to be realized in the material reorganization of the world. Well, under conditions of scholasticide, that is to say, the destruction of all higher education in Gaza now, the destruction of each and every university. Under conditions of scholasticide, we see the importance of educational infrastructure to all of these debates about academic freedom, even when it's not acknowledged. And now, when every last institution of higher education is destroyed, how do we think about rebuilding or calling for new universities or the restoration of those universities? Karma Nabulsi defined scholasticide in 2009, and the Human Rights Council of the UN has accepted her definitions, rightly noting that when the human right to education has been violated, also significantly, the future itself has been destroyed. When schools are destroyed, so too are hopes and dreams. Without education, that very sense of futurity is damaged. So the call for that futurity may well be an instance of an anti-fascist passion in our time. The right to education is, in effect, the call for that futurity. Nabulsi claims that freedom of thought, and I quote, posits possibilities, opens horizons, in clear contrast with the apartheid wall, the shackling checkpoints, and the choking prisons. Nabulsi adds that education provides a critical function in society, by which she means a way of imagining beyond and against existing limits, presumably imposed by societal conditions and state powers in the interests of inequality and exclusion. This critical function is fundamental to society in her view, and I would add democratic societies. That critical function is why, by the way, we are here today, making clear how crucial critique, the critical, is. But so too is the call to rebuild, a call driven by a passion to rebuild, to regenerate, an appeal to the world to honor and realize the right to education itself. Scholasticide, Nabulsi tells us, is a war waged against thought and imagination alike, or rather the infrastructural conditions that give occasion and form to thought and imagination. Education thus ideally provides an opening to ideals that any future democracy should realize, an opening that happens within the rubble where classes now convene, a way of imagining, of passionately holding to ideals with the power to disrupt, defeat fascist passions, even when, or precisely when, their material realization is indefinitely postponed. So thus, academic freedom requires the infrastructures of education, the right to education precedes and is connected to academic freedom. The crushing of extramural speech is also linked to the crushing of the infrastructural conditions of education itself. So a passionate call for the material reorganization of the world in the name of freedom, well, that also includes, I would suggest, a futurity without which no one should have to live. Thank you.
Thank you.